Subjectivism. In many ways, subjectivism is similar to cultural relativism. If you recall from the lectures on cultural relativism in the chapter in your textbook, the cultural relativist holds that what's moral or immoral is based upon what a particular culture says is moral or immoral. Now, what are cultures but collections of individuals? So what the subjectivist believes is that it's the individual which is the source of morality, rather than looking at the culture. So with cultures, we can see that there might be variations or differences between what individuals believe, but overall there might be a cultural consensus about something. So where the vast majority of people believe in doing things in one particular way, or have a set moral view about a particular issue. For the subjectivist, though, morality really is a matter of individual belief, or in some cases, individual feeling, depending on what type of subjectivist account we're talking about. So at its simplest, ethical subjectivism is simply the view that our moral opinions are based on our feelings and nothing more. So for a subjectivist, a belief statement is enough to count something as moral. If I believe something's moral, that's enough for me to say that it is moral. Now, the subjectivist position is actually a meta-ethical position. For the subjectivist doesn't actually tell us how to act. So if I want to say that I'm a subjectivist, if I say, well, for instance, let's take an example. Stealing is wrong. If I, as a subjectivist, say stealing is wrong, what am I really saying? Well, as a subjectivist, what I'm saying is something like that I believe stealing is wrong. Now, that doesn't tell you exactly how to behave. So if I want to say, if I said to you, is stealing wrong? What would the subjectivist say? Well, we don't actually have an answer. What we know is that that moral statement, whatever it is, if I said stealing is right, that moral statement's truth or falsity is going to depend upon what the subjective individual says. So that statement itself, or the subjectivism itself, doesn't tell us what's moral or immoral. It doesn't tell us how we ought to live. It tells us that if we want to know what any moral statement means, then we have to appeal to some sort of subjective feeling or belief. So this poses a problem in some part for moral action. How do I know which actions are right or wrong? Well, the subjectivist doesn't give me a guide for telling me which actions are right or wrong. What the subjectivist is really saying to me is, here is how we interpret moral statements. Here's what they mean at their core. So simple subjectivism says that whenever I make a statement like X is morally acceptable, or X is right, or X is good, all of these statements are really saying something like the following. I, the speaker, whoever's making the statement, approve of X. So that's all a simple subjectivist is actually saying about morality. All moral statements are based upon your subjective view. I, the speaker, approve or disapprove, believe or disbelieve, whatever, that X is the case or X is not the case. So here's where, again, why this is a meta-ethical position. It's not telling me what to do or what I ought to do. It's saying, well, what makes that moral statement true or false? Now, this is a really problematic position. One, it goes back to the relativist, and we can argue that there's, according to the subjectivist, there's no objective morality. Just like the cultural relativist says, well, morality is relative to a particular culture. What the subjectivist says is, well, morality is just sort of relative to individual feelings or beliefs. So there is no objective moral standard to appeal to. It's just simply what the speaker perhaps happens to believe. So what's the problem with simple subjectivism? Well, there's a number of problems with simple subjectivism. In some ways, this is almost a foolish moral theory. But we can point out some of the obvious ones. One is that no one is infallible. So if I'm a subjectivist and say, well, look, morality is just about what you believe. So if you ever say things, you hear this all the time in arguments. I often hear this in classes. When I'm presenting a moral position or I'm making a moral argument and I say, well, do you agree or disagree with this? And so I disagree with that. And I say, why? Well, that's just what I believe. Well, that in essence is a subjectivist position, right? That's saying that there is no reason that needs to be given, or that there is no reason that can be given, that it's There is no objective morality, and that's just my belief. And so there it is. There's my argument for you. But I could simply point out to someone, well, look, the fact that you believe something doesn't make it so. Just like we mentioned with cultural relativism, the fact that a culture may believe the earth is flat doesn't mean that the earth is flat. And the same can be held for any moral position. Just because one person believes stem cell research is immoral, that belief in and of itself doesn't tell me whether stem cell research is a good or bad thing. So no one is infallible. People make mistakes. We make mistakes all the time. If we accept simple subjectivism, one of the consequences is that there cannot be moral disagreement, though we do in fact seem to have moral disagreement about issues. And what I mean by that is that if morality ultimately boils down to simply what you believe, then if I say something like, as I gave, eating babies for breakfast is a good thing, and if you were to look at me and say, well, do you believe eating babies for breakfast is a good thing? And I say, yes, I believe that. And if you could actually look inside my head and see that I'm not lying at all, that in fact I'm telling you the truth, that inside my head I actually have a belief in which eating babies for breakfast is perfectly morally acceptable. You say, okay, it's a fact about you. That's what you believe. And then I say to you, do you think eating babies for breakfast is morally okay? And you say, no, that is absolutely morally wrong. And let's say I could look inside your head and see that in fact you're telling me the absolute truth, that it's a fact about you, that you believe that eating babies for breakfast is morally repugnant, it's wrong, you shouldn't do it. Well, there's nothing more to talk about, right? Because at the end of the day, it's not as if we can appeal. If we're both subjectivists, we can't appeal to some moral standard, some independent standard. That's what morality is. To say X is wrong or X is right is just to say, I believe X is right or I believe X is wrong. So there's no more to discuss. You believe what you believe. It's a fact about you. I believe what I believe. It's a fact about me. And let's go our own way. But that seems to be a poor way to deal with morality. We think in morality that there are different positions on a moral issue and that there is some sort of right solution to the problem, that there is some morally correct way of behaving, or there's a morally correct way of not behaving. So one way or the other, subjectivism doesn't allow for any moral disagreement. Now, there's a sort of a response to subjectivism. Some may argue, well, subjectivism maybe is too simplistic. So maybe it isn't just about belief statements. I approve or disapprove, believe or disbelieve something. Maybe morality is based on something more intuitive, like our emotions. So emotivism says, well, look, if the problem of subjectivism is this truth and falsity, it's true of me, I believe a statement, it's false of you that you believe some other moral statement. If that's the case, how about we get rid of the notion of true or false? Maybe morality isn't about truth or falsity. So the subjectivist says that when I see something, when I say murder is wrong, what I'm saying is I, the speaker, approve, or in this case, disapprove of murder. So I'm reporting what my belief is about that subject. And that can either be true or false. Either it's true about me that I believe murder is right, or it's false about me that I believe murder is right. The emotivist, on the other hand, says maybe what morality really does is express your feelings about something. It's more like a command. It says something like, hurrah for X. I don't know who says hurrah anymore, but yay X maybe would be a better way to put it. So hurrah for X or hooray X or yay X just means that when I see a particular action, either I have a feeling about it in terms of I either approve of it or I disapprove on sort of a gut level. This is what the emotivist says is what we do when we make a moral statement. Now, you can sort of think of this in the following way. Imagine that we're sitting in an actual classroom and I walk into the classroom. You see me, your instructor, walking in the classroom, and as I walk in the classroom, I pull out a knife and I go to this first student in the first row and I stab the student. The knife goes into the student and the student falls to the desk dead. Now, there's two possible responses you might have to my action. If you're a subjectivist and you're evaluating what just happened, you might say, I saw the instructor come in, they pulled out a knife, they stabbed some student in the front without any provocation whatsoever, student died. And then you say, do I believe that action was wrong? I think I do. And so, all right, I, whoever it happens to be speaking, disapprove of that action. That action was wrong. Now, that's one sort of response you might have to my action. On the other hand, if you're an emotivist, you might say, well, look, that's not what happens. The instructor walked in the room, pulled out a knife, stabbed the student, and all of a sudden I say, no, stop, don't do that, boo. Any of those sorts of things, you didn't stop to think, do I have a particular belief statement about the action? But you simply looked at the action and immediately had sort of a visceral reaction to it. This is what the emotivist thinks morality is about. It's sort of our reaction to those situations. We're expressing our feelings about a particular action. So we don't sit back and sort of rationally and logically just simply look and say, is this a belief about me? No, we have an immediate reaction to certain moral situations. And so the emotivist says it's not about being true or false, it's whether we approve or disapprove. And then our expressing of approval or disapprove is something like a command, right? It's saying, don't do that. So when I have a negative emotional reaction, what I'm really saying when I say boo X or whatever is I'm saying, don't do that. And when I have a positive reaction to something, I'm saying, good, do that. So moral statements are essentially for the emotivist commands. They don't state facts at all. They're not true or false. And just to make this clear, if I say to you something like, shut the door, true or false, you look at me and go, shut the door, true. That doesn't make any sense. There is no true or false. If I said, is the door open, or the door is open, well, that statement would be true or false. But shut the door is simply a command. And that's what the emotivist says. It's not about the truth or falsity of particular statements. It's about whether or not we approve or disapprove on sort of an emotional or feeling level. Now, there's several virtues of emotivism. First of all, we have the problem of fallibility is avoided, since the statements aren't true or false. I mean, to say that my belief is right or wrong, correct or incorrect, would imply that there's truth or falsity. But emotivism avoids the notion of statements that are either true or false. The emotivist is simply saying, no, this is an expression of feeling, and that feeling is expressed in some sort of command. So we don't have a problem with fallibility. And the other is that we have a different sense of disagreement. There can be factual disagreement, and there's disagreements about what we think ought to happen. So there's disagreements about attitudes, and there are disagreements in attitudes. In the case of emotivism, what we have is we can have disagreements in attitude, and we can try to change someone else's attitude, right? We can say, I feel one way, you feel another. Now, if I can convince you in some way to change your feelings, then we can actually have something like a moral debate. It's not just you feel one way, I feel another, or better put, you believe something, I believe something else, we're done discussing. It's, look, can't we actually talk in a way or debate in a way where I maybe change your attitude about something? I can change the way you feel about a particular issue. So emotivism avoids the fallibility problem of simple subjectivism, and it allows that we still have moral disagreement, that we can actually debate something. Now, of course, if this were the end of the discussion, we could say, well, emotivism has won the day. Cultural relativism, we're going to put that aside. We're going to put simple subjectivism. But emotivism is the moral theory we ought to embrace, or at least the meta position we ought to embrace. Well, one of the problems with emotivism is that we can't account for good or bad reasoning in ethics. Now, understand what this means. Think in terms of objective moral standards. Both the subjectivists and the emotivists deny that there are objective right and wrongs. So now, let's imagine that I hold a sort of morally repugnant position, something like certain races are inferior to others, or certain groups are inferior to others. And you say, okay, let's now imagine that I can put together a lot of really good rhetoric, very good arguments, or maybe not even arguments would be, but I can convince you to change your feeling. You say, oh no, I would never discriminate against a particular group. And let's say I can actually bring up prejudices or biases or fears or whatever to change the way you feel, where you start listening and you say, you know, I'm starting to feel differently about this. Now, there might be no justification for feeling differently. It might not be that I'm putting out facts, but I'm putting out things that just change your emotional feelings about something. In such a case, if I changed your feelings and suddenly made you into someone who's prejudiced or racist or whatever, that would be fine. I've made my case. And you say, but wait, that can't be what we mean about ethics. Ethics has got to be about reasons and justification. Well, again, for the emotivist, we don't have that to rely on, right? We don't have the ability to say, oh, there's an objective standard. See, clearly you're missing this objective aspect of morality. No, Good and bad reasoning don't matter. What matters is how you feel about something. That's what makes a moral statement true or false. Or I should say, that's what makes you approve or disapprove of a moral statement. And in such cases, if I can change the way you feel, I can change your approval or disapproval, then that's just as good a reason, quote unquote, as any other. Now, if moral statements are commands intended to change the attitude or behavior of another, then any reason given that successfully changes someone's attitude is morally appropriate. So that's just sort of the conclusion of what I've just said, is that if statements are just commands and they're not true or false, then look, if I'm really good at convincing, if I'm really good at making arguments or using clever tricks with words, and I change the way you feel, then that's enough to count as a morally appropriate argument. And I think we want to say that there's something wrong with that. That it can't be just about how I feel. That sometimes what I feel isn't what I'm morally required to do or not do. So, for instance, it might be the case that I may not feel compassion for certain people. Let's say I have sort of a reaction to people. They make me uncomfortable. So say people on the street who are asking for money. And let's assume that there are people who are actually in desperate straits. So it's not because of bad decisions, but simply bad luck. When these people come to me, I may be afraid of them for whatever reason. I may not like to be around. It may disturb me to look at. I may have all these negative feelings about those individuals, but that wouldn't change the fact that maybe I have a moral obligation to help them. So we want to be careful, I think, in ethics, that we don't allow emotion to override what might be our moral obligations. It becomes dangerous if morality is just based on whether you feel like being moral. And this is what the emotivist seems to be advocating, is that sometimes if you don't feel one way or the other, then you have no moral obligation. Proofs in ethics. So what then amounts to a proof in ethics? In part, for the subjectivists and the emotivists, there is nothing that counts as a proof. In fact, proofs are not really needed. And this is what is troubling about both subjectivism and emotivism, because they seem to imply that reason isn't an important element in morality. Now, I think for many of us, we think that, in fact, reason is important, that being able to give reasons and justified reasons for particular actions or moral positions is important. But for the emotivist and the subjectivist, both of these positions believe in what's called the no-proof argument. And the no-proof argument goes something like this. If there were any such thing as objective truths in ethics, we should be able to prove that some moral opinions are true and others are false. So for both the subjectivists and the emotivists, they would argue that, look, if there's an objective morality, if there's an absolute right and wrong, then surely we should be able to come up with some sort of proof that some moral statement is true while others is false. But, in fact, we can't prove which moral opinions are true and which are false. Therefore, there is no such thing as objective truth in ethics. So if we think about it, when we look for answers to moral questions, we can't look under a microscope like the scientist. Right? We look for, or the astronomer. Let's look into the heavens and say, oh, can we watch the planets move, and can we track these mathematically, and can we make predictions? And it turns out that when we look in the world, whether it's under an electron microscope or some sort of Hubble Space Telescope, we don't find ethics. And so the subjectivists and emotivists seem to be implying, or not even implying, but directly stating, that there just isn't any proof that can be given for moral statements to be true or false. Now, there's a couple of responses we can give to this no-proof argument. First, we can say that there's an inappropriate standard of proof. In other words, the subject matter of ethics is not equivalent to the subject matter of science. Ethics is not looking for a empirical reality. It's not looking for something that can be discovered through something like a microscope or telescope. That there are proofs in science, and that those proofs are not the same thing as proofs in ethics. And the same can be said for mathematics. There are proofs in mathematics that are not the same as proofs in science, which are not the same as proofs in ethics. And we could argue that just because ethics hasn't proven the same amount of things, say, that science has, it doesn't mean that it's not possible that it will. So difficult proofs in ethics are analogous to difficult proofs in science. Science hasn't answered all the questions of science, and we don't discount science simply because, well, we don't have concrete answers about a number of things. And the same thing can be said of mathematics. In mathematics, there are difficult elements of mathematics, things that haven't been figured out in mathematics, proofs for statements that take centuries to come about, if they come about at all, but we don't discount mathematics. Now, I think all of this notion of proof in ethics, is something that often runs through students' minds, that at the end of the day, a number of students will say things like, well, ethics is fine, it's well and good to study ethics, but it doesn't have the certainty of things like mathematics or science. That at the end of the day, those things have some really solid evidence or proof behind them, some reasons behind them, whereas ethics doesn't have that. So I want to talk just for a moment, just briefly, about what a proof in ethics, or what the value of studying ethics and things like subjectivism and emotivism and the Kantian and utilitarian theories and the other things we're going to be studying. I want to show what the value of those things are, even if we can say that we still have a lot of work to do in those areas. So let me give you an example. I'm assuming that most, if not all of you, have taken geometry. And if I were to ask a class, and I won't embarrass you by having you write this in, but if you took geometry, say, what's the fundamental starting point of Euclidean geometry? And I think after maybe you ponder this for a while, you'd come up with, well, the point is the most fundamental starting point, right? We start with, in geometry, points. And what is a point? Well, a point is something that has no length, no width, and no depth. So let's think about that for a minute. You start your geometry lesson with something that has no length, no width, and no depth. Now, when I see on your screen here, I have an arrow pointing to a point. Is that a point? Well, the answer is no, it's not a point. You say, what do you mean it's not a point? Well, a point has no length, no width, and no depth. And clearly, from what you see on your screen, it has at least length and width. Maybe it has some depth at a microscopic level. So that can't be a point. And if we think about that, something with no length, no width, and no depth is nothing. If you don't have length, width, or depth, you don't have anything. So it's conceptually, it's a position, but it's nothing. Now you say, well, fine, so what's the implication? Well, if a point has no length and no width and no depth, and we take an infinite number of points and put them side by side, what do we get? We get a line. So a line is an infinite number of points extending in two directions. But wait a minute. If an infinite number of points in two directions is a line, lines are composed of points, and points have no length, no width, no depth, then lines are made up of, wait for it, nothing. Now, what happens when we take some lines and put three of them together? Oh, we get triangles. So triangles are composed of lines, which are composed of points, which are composed of nothing. So the question is, what did you study in geometry? Well, apparently you studied nothing. Now I say, wait, that can't possibly be. Of course I studied something in geometry. And I would say, yes, you did study something in geometry. You studied a conceptual system. You started with certain assumptions, things like points and lines and angles and so forth. And from those you derived other theorems. And those theorems are actually very practical, because the very building you're sitting in, the house or building or wherever you are, those things were constructed using geometry, using what followed from those assumptions in geometry. Well, the same could be said of ethics, that if we embrace a particular ethical system, that we assume certain things. We assume, for instance, in utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest number is what matters. Well, if we assume that principle, just like we assume a point, what follows from that? Does that lead us to better interactions with other human beings? Are people made more happy by following that principle? What is the implication of that conceptual system? So just like geometry, ethical principles, ethical ideas have real-world application. They have real-world consequences. And that's what we look at in ethics. Which system better helps us live? Geometry does the same thing. Geometry, by studying a geometric system, we have certain assumptions that lead to practical applications. What keeps these buildings up that we're in all the time when we're at the university? is geometry. And so what I want to say is that when we're thinking about ethics, let's not try to think of ethics in terms of science. Let's think of it in terms of a conceptual system. What are the assumptions we're making? What follows from those assumptions? Are they good or bad? Do they help us live better or not? Do they do some work for us? So we don't have to ask of ethics, perhaps, that it has the same sort of certainty as mathematics or physics or something else. And we can go on and on about all the ambiguities in those areas. But let's just ask the question, do these things do some valuable work? If we embrace one set of assumptions, do they lead to some sort of good outcomes that we find desirable?